Hi. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, particularly elders Auntie Margaret Gardner and Auntie Di Kerr and Auntie Joy Wanden Murphy, because I mentioned this symposium to them and they liked the idea. So now I'm going to share my screen and hope this works. Actually, first I have to share. That's it. So this is actually a half-hour presentation, I'm afraid. It's a bit long-winded. It was actually a 12,000 word paper. I just kept cutting and cutting it. So every time I make a large claim, just imagine there's a whole paragraph of statistics there, you know, for your delectation. Okay. Good. And let's go back to the beginning. Sorry about this. All right. This paper is called Traces of Sovereignty, Smoke Plumes in Colonial Imagery. In the Australian Black Summer of 2019 to 2020, plumes of dense acrid smoke from bushfires circled the globe, discolouring New Zealand glaciers only to rejoin the pall already shrouding our cities. Hundreds of years earlier, in the first colonial profiles and inland surveys of colonial exploratory prints, wisps of smoke uncurled in unchartered territory. Do you see them along the horizon there? We can see both as signals of human presence on this continent. The most recent arose from the ashes of a climate crisis, a calamity of wholesale destruction that consumed an area the size of England, dozens of lives, thousands of homes, and billions of wildlife. And as Wemba Wemba and Gunditjmara researcher Paula Ballard reminds us, millennia of Aboriginal heritage and country. The earlier, more benign plumes in colonial prints could be seen as the heraldic unfurling of Indigenous sovereignty. At the time, these were seen as signs of human presence. These two very different emanations of fire, Indigenous and settler, bookend the outer parameters of what Andreas Malm has called fossil empire, referencing the burning of fossil fuels in service to colonial expansion. Coal-fired industrialisation and colonial invasion, I'm arguing, were interdependent economies of expansion. And in retrospect, viewed through the lens of the current climate crisis, colonial prints reveal the interstices of coal and colonialism and the ways they were bound together in a logic of extraction. The carbon that fuels bushfires is the product of historical emissions from burning the fossilised photosynthesis that was underway in the deep past. The emissions that precipitate such fires are only now having these disastrous consequences due to the cumulative effect of burning coal, oil and gas at accelerating rates, which planetary biomes and ecosystems can no longer reabsorb. But settlers were not the first to have their lives severely disrupted by the culminating disasters precipitated by colonial extraction and its protracted aftermath. The erasure of the biome by fossil capital, itself the engine of colonial modernity, was presaged by the erasure of Indigenous sovereignty. The plumes of smoke that billowed into our carbon-drenched atmosphere from the East Coast bushfires that terrifying summer originated in the global carbon cycle of steam-powered industrialisation. In the feedback loops of colonial carbon, the emissions from industrialisation have a diffuse causality within climate-intensified events such as the New South Wales fires, the plumes of which in turn billow more CO2 into the atmosphere. Thus, as Malm writes, global heating is seriously backloaded from the past, yet also substantially deferred into the future. The shroud of smoke from fire signals, he says, is carbon history falling in on the present. With a growing number of climate historians, Malm fingers the birthplace of the fossil economy in Britain. By 1865, the black combustible rock of coal was already precipitating a dangerous new world. The economist William Stanley Jevons declared coal the factor in everything we do. Steam powered by black gold, by then also extracted from Bengali, Trinidad, Vancouver, Borneo, Nankin, Natal, and the southern tip of Africa, was extolled as the acknowledged new element of advancement, by which this age is distinguished from all that have preceded it. By its magic power, distance is set at naught, and the productions of the antipodes are brought rapidly together. Coal, therefore, must henceforth be the motor and the meter of all commercial nations. Without it, no modern people can become great, either in manufactures or in the naval art of war. Malm has historicised the infrastructure of steam, mines and depots of coal, steamboats and railroads to understand how Britain prosecuted what I've elsewhere called coal-fired colonialism, by which I referred to this current climate crisis in climate and extinction as first kindled by coal-fired colonialism with its ethos of extraction and elimination, none of which could have been realised without the erasure of First Nations sovereignty. Settler and Indigenous fire practices manifest a relation to fire and emissions so at odds, we've been left gasping through summers wherein settler conflagration annually consumes estates that traditional burning practices kept park-like and flourishing for millennia. Once emptied of its custodians and carers, these estates soon became fire-prone. Aboriginal rangers pursue a practice of fire governance, fundamentally at odds with settler firefighting. Paula Baulo reminds us of the demonisation of fire by Christian missionaries and its association with hell and damnation. Traditions in agricultural burning, such as rotational swidden farming in England, had by settlement been disparaged and outmoded as unscientific. Yet Jacques Arago, Captain Freycinet's draftsman in the 1820 voyage, leaves us a detailed account of the clearing of the back blocks of Sydney Cove, which provides insight into fire as a European technique of clearing and explicitly of dispossession. He writes, from the midst of those deep forests that lately were trodden by the feet of savages alone, arise immense columns of smoke impelled by the wind, amid which burns a bright flame illuminating the distant horizon. All the new grants are cleared by burning. An old trunk of a tree at first resists the fire. By degrees, its moist coverings dry, are charred, and it becomes itself fuel to feed it. The branches are consumed and bring down with them the neighbouring branches, which soon communicate the flames to the remotest trees. But as these burnings must be frequently repeated, and the proprietor of a piece of ground must guarantee the adjacent property, he begins by circumscribing with the axe the space he means to cultivate. The fire, arriving at this boundary, as it ceases to find ailment, stops, dies away, and its beneficent ashes give life to the land it has thus cleared. Fire had an expediency and valency for Europeans that was explicitly linked to techniques of dispossession. The lately trodden forests are thus cleared of savages for new grants of land. As Paulo powerfully contends of recent fires, Aboriginal people feel burnt out again by colonial fire displacement and the ecocidal manifestation of colonial practices. She writes, in comparison to the constructive, regenerative and protective nature of Aboriginal cultural burning methods and practices, colonial fires set and used against our people and country can only ever be viewed as destructive, violent, and predatory erasure. Fallow is confirmed by Cal Powers White, who sees settler colonialism as the inflicting of burdensome environmental change on another society. The climate emergency is not unlike the smoke that enveloped our most populated capitals that fearful summer. It is invasive, menacing, enveloping, and shape-shifting. In this paper, we will see settler perceptions of Indigenous fire practices graphically depicted in two early engravings of Newcastle, Malabimba, by convict artists Walter Preston and Richard Brown. Yet this retrospective lens is also overlaid through a smoked lens of reckoning with the climate emergency. I have a wasp in my light. In the selected engravings, we perceive two immiscible fumes, settler and Aboriginal, the looping causality between coal, colonialism, images of Aboriginal plumes and colonial topography, and changing technologies of printing offer another way to reflect on altering conditions of Australian bushfires with its many layers of loss. In this paper, I examine the ways that colonial exploitation of coal exemplifies the complicity of imperialism with industrialisation and global environmental degradation, and how this is evidenced in colonial visual conventions of smoke. How do we view such colonial artworks of Aboriginal camp, ceremonial and traditional burning through eyes recently stinging from the pall of the climate crisis? The discovery of coal by Europeans at Newcastle, by escaped convicts in 1791 was the reason Newcastle was established in 1801 after it was surveyed in 1797 by Lieutenant John Shortland as an outlying penal settlement for secondary offenders, and how it came to be depicted in the two prints examined here. The story of the early Newcastle engravings imparts an impression of these looping causalities. Placed together, the two prints form a mini panorama of the settlement originally called Coal River. It was established as a penal settlement for secondary offenders, which included the convict artists Richard Brown, he was there from until 1817, and Walter Preston. While convict artists' graphic skills were deployed there by their commandants, first under Scotto and then Captain James Wallace, to document the natural history and the progress of the township, most of the convicts sent to Newcastle became colliers. Indeed, the historical coincidence of coal and incursion into New Holland is recursive. Watt's coal-fired steam engine was invented just 2 years before the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove, although as Malm shows it was some decades before it was taken up in earnest. While the Worimi peoples in the Newcastle region knew of the combustible quality of coal and may have burnt it in the very fires which the plumes depicted in these engravings issued, it was a group of fugitive convicts who were the first Europeans said to discover coal along its beaches in 1791. Their desperate attempt to escape to Timor, they rowed from Sydney to Timor, was widely reported in the London press and colonial publications, and their remarkable story was lent significance due to their fortuitous discovery of the coal that would soon supply Sydney town and beyond. So after Shortland surveyed the area in 1791, coal mining began near Nobby's Head, and small quantities of coal were shipped to Port Jackson from the Coal River settlement. By 1801, 160 tonnes of coal were raised weekly. Coal was the colony's second export after wool by 1807. From 1809, it was bartered to the Cape of Good Hope in exchange for wine, and in the following year for the use of the British Navy, then to India from 1814 and the East India Company the year before, the next year. By 1815, a directive was given to all of the colony's troops and government departments that they must use coal rather than more expensive firewood. Over the coming decades, fleets from the rapidly expanding Australian southeastern pastures supplied the Lancashire wool mills as steam-powered mechanisation began to replace the hand loom and spinning from the 1820s. Coal literally stoked the engines of colonial incursion. Wastelands, seemingly uncultivated tracts said to be underutilised by their native inhabitants, were surveyed as abundant lands that would shore up the wealth of, in fact, an elite class of British capitalists, the same landowning Britons who had closed off nearly 7 million acres of commons and open fields through the Enclosure Acts, to become the 0.6% of the population who by 1872 owned 98.5% of the agricultural land in Britain, and their descendants are all sitting in the House of Lords to this day. Steam-powered threshing machines had begun to industrialise agriculture in this period. My forebears, brothers Thomas and William Wadley, were among the disenfranchised swing rioters in Oxfordshire who broke these machines and were transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1831 for their trouble. The gradual shift from water wheel to steam power on a commercial scale in the Midlands of Britain from the late 18th century powered an explosion in manufacturing between 1760 and 1840, drawing raw materials from the colonial peripheries. From 1814, soon after the Newcastle mini panorama was first printed in Sydney, coal was just beginning to power the first steam printing press. As this new technology was taken up over the ensuing decades, it would come to replicate colonial illustration for a growing reading public, voracious for news and pictorial description of any discovery and development on the colonial frontier. Arriving in Sydney in 1798, the printer Absalom West was an entrepreneurial emancipist and brewer. In March 1812, he printed 2 views of Sydney by the convict artist John Eyre, engraved by Philip Slager. He advertised them in the Sydney Gazette for sale from its office. In January 1813, West printed a set of 12 views of Sydney, Port Jackson, Botany Bay, Parramatta, and Newcastle. 4 were credited to Eyre, 2 others were thought to be from his originals, and the Newcastle mini panorama from Prospect Hill was engraved by Preston, possibly after Brown's watercolour from the same place in 1807. Richard Brown had been sentenced, his crime was unspecified, in Dublin, and he arrived in Sydney in July 1811. After a second offence, he was sent to Newcastle that year. He is better known for his later portraits, more than 50 survive, of named Aboriginal individuals, which appear to be caricatures in the silhouette style, yet also closely documented ethnographic detail. Brown's watercolour skills had already been deployed by the first commandant of Newcastle, Thomas Scotto, to illustrate his manuscript, the first printed album of natural history of the colony. The art movement that took wing in the outlying coal mining and penal settlement, since dubbed the Newcastle Academy, drew on conventions in topographical depictions. And quoting from a catalogue, between 1812 and 1822, a remarkable legacy of works of art was created in Newcastle through the chance association of a succession of the garrison's artistically inclined military officers and a few convicts in their charge, with skills as painters, engravers, and craftsmen. They included Richard Brown and Walter Preston under the command of first Thomas Scotto and then Captain James Wallace. West's album of views are the first locally published topographic printmaking venture in Australia, or as he announced in his advertisement in the Sydney Gazette, this first specimen of the graphic art presented to the inhabitants of the colony. They were soon followed by Wallace's album entitled An Historical Account of the Colony of New South Wales and its Dependent Settlements, in illustration of 12 views, engraved by W. Preston, a convict, from drawings taken on the spot. The second album, of 12 topographies of New South Wales, to be engraved in Australia, It was printed, however, in London under Wallace's supervision in 1821. The earlier West album's views, which included the Newcastle Plumes you're looking at now, were purchased in London by the librarians of King George III after 1814. And to give a sense of the global circuits of print and coal that same year, the Times newspaper was the first to be printed using the new steam-powered, coal-fired rotary press. From 1785 to 1821, the number of master printers in London doubled. As such, over the period, these earliest colonial topographies were produced. Changes to printmaking technology were afoot that, through coal, would come to greatly enhance the dissemination of colonial imagery. The series of 12 engravings, West published in 1813, and the later 12 views published in the Wallace album of 1821, were quite literally prospects for settlement, as the historical account bound with the Wallace album explains. To those who are fond of tracing the progress of countries and watching the advances of associated industry and ingenuity, these faithful representations of the incipient state of a colony, which is in all probability destined at no remote period to become the mistress of the Southern Hemisphere, it is conceived cannot but be particularly gratifying to the future historian, and indeed to the inhabitants in general of Australasia. They will prove, as it were, a living record of the exertions of their forefathers and serve perhaps to excite to a generous rivalry in the breasts of the endless migratory bands that will hereafter branch off from this central stock of population until the whole of this fifth continent be overspread and colonised. In keeping with Arago's description above, the author goes on to extol how the awful silence of the once primeval forest will be converted into plains covered with bleating flocks, lowing herds and waving corn, and will become the smiling seats of industry and the social arts, and be changed from a mournful and desolate wilderness into the cheerful village, the busy town, and the crowded city. In both the West and Wallace albums, Aboriginal people often appear as starfish, that is, little figures in the foreground, either in distant canoes or in the last scene as the main subjects, a funeral procession of Bagara. Yet the textual description quoted above intimates that these very people are somehow out of the picture of colonisation, and indeed that their estates, the forests, had always lain silent. The text casts these traces of presence, of sovereignty, as merely ephemeral, as though Aboriginal habitation might disappear over the horizon in distant canoes, or edge out of the picture as starfish, or die off in a funeral, or go up in a puff of smoke in distant plumes. Foregrounded in the brown Preston First Newcastle plate, the left side of the mini panorama, is the chimney smoke of a settler cottage, conveying the permanency of residency. By the time Wallace publishes his view of Newcastle engraved by Preston, printmaking was extolled as manifesting progress, since a key expression among the nascent cities and grand houses to this triumph of civilization was the engravings themselves, for the fine arts demonstrate just how far the colony had progressed in a mere 32 years, from attending only to wants and necessities to producing such objects of luxury and refinement as these printed plates. The engravings were elegancies, and in themselves offer the most striking proof of the unparalleled progress of the colony. Similarly, the earlier activation of a printing press as one of the first acts of Governor Hunter was tied explicitly to the colony's project, the advantages of which soon became obvious in the more ready communication of all orders for the regulation of the settlement. The 1813 West album and the 1821 Wallace album, printed in London by Rudolph Ackerman and supervised there by Wallace, fulfilled these expectations. We start to see just how critical printing and the visual documentation of the colony's progress was how important it was to prefer before the readership of potential migratory bands these literal prospects for settlement in which Aboriginal custodians now appear outnumbered, pacified, or as ephemeral as smoke. Within this frame of colonial progress, evidenced in the beginnings of a locally produced visual library, the skills of the Newcastle convict artists, notably Lycett and Preston, were put to good use by the Irish-born Commandant James Wallace, who, as print curator Alyssa Bunbury explains, worked with a camera lucida. As a naval officer, Wallace was trained in topographical drawing, and his images included showcasing work. He started on the causeway out to Nobby's Head, Waibagamba, along with the hospital, barracks, jail, guardhouse, school and Christchurch. But there was more to Wallace's appointment to the Newcastle outpost. Wallace had proved indispensable in clearing the colony's frontier of its custodians. 3 months before taking up his post as Commandant of Newcastle in June 1816, Wallace had in April led a detachment of soldiers against the Dharawal people on the Cumberland Plain in response to a series of Aboriginal outrages and farmers' reprisal raids. His party advanced on a camp at 1 a.m. in the morning, shooting at least 14 people. An unknown number were driven to their deaths over the gorge of the Cataract River, some 60 metres deep. Following Macquarie's orders, Wallace strung up the bodies of 3 victims. 2 were warriors named Durrell and Canabayagal, alongside a woman, from trees to instill, as ordered, a greater terror in the survivors. Their skulls were sent to England, held in the anatomy department of the University of Edinburgh for 175 years, and only repatriated in 1991 to the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. While Preston engraved all of the 12 views in the 1821 Wallace album and some of those in the 1813 West album, it is notable that the fulsome dedications to Governor Macquarie, who ordered the attack, only appear under the West views. Preston was possibly appraised of the massacre on the Cumberland Plains, given it was led by his commandant, Captain Wallace, and since the deaths of settlers were reported in the Sydney Gazette. While Wallace is thought to have been inspired by the West album to publish his own, he did not dedicate his prints to Macquarie. Instead, the London publisher Rudolf Ackerman included in the 1821 edition an extract from the Sydney Gazette from December 1818, in which Governor Macquarie credited Wallace with the highest commendation for performing his duties as Commandant of Newcastle. Wallace was praised as humane and a gentleman. When the context for Wallace's appointments are read against his album of engraved views of New South Wales, the underpinnings of colonial violence in visual production are laid bare. Omitted in the views, dedications and commendations is Wallace and Macquarie's collusion over frontier violence, and in its place, Aboriginal people are positioned as pacified and ephemeral staffage or displaced into distant campfires. The plumes of smoke recorded in exploratory and coastal inland profiles might now be read as traces of sovereignty. These smoke signals pictured in the colonial print library have significance in first contact scenario encounters and beyond. They comprise first sightings. With the work of Bruce Pascoe, Bill Gamage and others, we can think of these plumes as evidence of economy and cultivation. In retrospect, we see in these plumes either signalling to other clans or tribes, gatherings for ceremony, fire stick farming or cooking, making implements, and an array of economic activities. Most compelling from our perspective, we see evidence of a cosmology of fire that is life-enhancing and underpinning of economy rather than life and economy destroying. The destruction of so much of this heritage in the Black Summer fires references back to another economy at work in these lands, managed by Aboriginal fire practitioners at the time they were still being documented in colonial prints, rethinking history through the lens of climate change, as this paper attempts, contextualises these colonial prints within the advent of the fossil economy with the added knowledge of colonial incursion and its extinguishment of sovereignty. We see the carbon underpinnings at work in the production and dissemination of these prints, changing our perception of the plumes detailed within them. Malm asks us to see power as power, namely the energy regime of fossil fuels and the mobility of people, ideas, technologies, goods and visual culture as projected out to the peripheries that they impelled. Focusing on the new organisation of labour through the harnessing of steam to automation, Malm puts simply, steam arose as a form of power exercised by some people against others. Yet in his careful and expansive study of textile industrialisation through coal-fired steam, he doesn't explore either its dependence on slavery in cotton production, nor wool production underpinned by the usurping of Aboriginal people in southeastern Australia for sheep. The Van Diemen's Land Company, for instance, was a joint stock company with a royal charter, and its directors were all London merchants closely associated with the wool industry. Through their expansion into the northwest of Tasmania, they pursued an unofficial policy of extermination. Steam power, and as we saw in the historical account from the Wallace album above, printed engravings too, were some of the ways colonials distinguished themselves from savages. In their printed images, they sought to mark the progress of civilization. To conclude, the foundational denial of terra nullius presages and underpins climate change denial. Australia's catastrophic summer was very much part of a global trend of increasing wildfires, yet its reach is also historical, back to the inception of industrialised capital and the dependence on burning carbon to fuel colonial expansion. The wildfire plumes delineate the long tail of the Industrial Revolution as precipitating the subordination of most of the world's people and usable resources to the imperial and financial structures of the Atlantic powers. Within an emergent global citizenship of the biome, Aboriginal cultural burning offers a genuine counterpoint to these alarming historical and geopolitical trajectories of destruction. In partnership and within carefully articulated protocols of collaboration, we could see a shift in the management of fire as a tool to cultivate and care for country rather than a threatening foe to be fought and contained. The distant plumes in colonial prints we've discussed here can then be seen through a new lens in recognition of the diverse ways Indigenous peoples have demanded recognition of their sovereignty, but also in rethinking how we might encounter sovereignty in such archives. Their ephemeral presence on official government documents and colonial artworks, such as the Newcastle engravings, had then and still have significance as placeholders for sovereignty, potentially even in native title claims. In these rare first sightings of Aboriginal habitation prior to first contact, we see traces of sovereignty for country that can be lit up again by custodial cultivation rather than going up in settler smoke. Thank you.